Good morning. Here we are in Temple Baptist Church Sunday School again, and it's good to have you back with us again today. And we are looking now in third chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's an interesting book to say the very least, an interesting chapter just to say the very least. And so I don't know how many of y'all out there kind of give your age away, but back in 69, the late 60s, there was a movement in this country called the Age of Aquarius, and it was an interesting time, and I spent most of my part of that overseas, and that was interesting too, but there was a group, and they had a song out. It's called The Dawning of the Age of Aquarius. And they set that up on Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. And that's kind of an interesting thing that when Solomon wrote that, he wrote that up, and there's 28 times and seasons there, but there's 14 pairs of what we call polar opposites in there. And they have a word for this called merisms. In Psalms chapter 139, verses 2 and 3 gives another example of these polar opposite things that he's talking about here. But he starts out there, and he says, to everything there's a season, a time to every purpose under the sun. There is a time. You know, I'm 72 years old and seen a lot of things come and go in this old world in that time, and there's a time of seasons in life, and I don't know I don't know where it's at, but I've seen that youth and baby, kid, youth, young man, middle-aged man, and all that thing go and come and go, and now probably in the late season, or some people even say the winter season of my life. And we don't know about that. I don't know about that. It's probably a good thing that we don't. But the point in all that is that nothing happens by accident, or we call things accidents or coincidences or not. But God has a plan. He has a plan for my life and your life, and our reaction to those are what makes the difference. Whether we have a good, happy life, or even when the bad things happen, that we can be happy in the Lord in those times. But for everything, there is a season, and there's a time to every purpose under the heavens or under creation. In God's economy and God's way of doing things, there is a purpose behind what He does. God does not just snap His fingers and say, oh, we'll do this, that over there today, and we'll go over here tomorrow and we'll play around with that bunch and see what happens. No, there is a purpose to life. He goes on there, he begins there in verse 2, and he said there's a time to be born. We are not accidentally born. It's not an accident that I was born on Christmas Eve in 1948. That's just that was a time. God had a time and a plan for my life that began there. It's interesting that when he starts this out, he said a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. And when you see this parallelism in there, these opposites, these polar opposites in these things. And you read that, there's a time to be born, and then he says, the other side of that, there's a time to plant. There's a time for our life to start, a time for us to move and go and do, but also there's a time to die. That may be, we don't know when that is. That's in God's providence too, that He has set our number of days, and we have a responsibility to do and be the best bondservant that we can be for the Lord. And that should be our purpose in life, not to get out of focus on this. There's this time to die, and he says there in the last part of verse 2, there's a time to pluck up. There's a harvest time. I think whenever my time is up, whenever that may be, I'm going to look at that right now like it may be a harvest time, because God has saved me back a long time ago, and I've tried to do and be the kind of servant He would want me to be. But there's going to come a time when I'm going to graduate. I'm going to get out of this thing that where God is trying to nurture me and grow me into what He wants me to be. But there's going to be a harvest time one of these days, and I'm going to go home. And that's kind of what verse 2 says. And it's interesting that he starts this out and he'll end it the same way in this course of Scripture here, that the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, is the way that he has started this out. And we are all in this thing called life together. And we all have our times that we were born, and we'll all have that time when we're going to go, short of the rapture of the church. That's the way of things. He says there in verse 3, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. There's war, there is capital punishment. There is a time that, in war people die, and it's an awful thing. It's not like you see on TV at all, and no need to sugarcoat it and say that it is. But there's a time to kill, but there's a time to break down, and a time to heal, as well as a time to kill. There's a time to heal. I think about this maybe more when I was reading this more of a spiritual level. We sometimes have a reputation, Christians have a reputation for killing our wounded. And that ought not be. When people are hurting, that's when they need us, they don't need to be kicked in the teeth. And so we kind of could work on that a little bit. I know back years ago in another church, I had a couple that was in my Sunday school class, and they were murdered, and it was just cold-blooded murder. And that individual's still on death row yet today, and that's been years and years and years and years ago, and that kind of thing just ought not be so, but it is. Anyway, he said he also acknowledged that there's times when a situation calls for healing. And again, on a spiritual level, in our church, and I thank the Lord here that at Temple Baptist Church you just don't see this, but grudges and plotting and things like that, they have no place in the church. There's a time if there are differences of opinions, then we can voice our opinions and agree to disagree agreeably. And I think here at this church we're very, very good at that because we're people and we have different opinions, and realizing that we're all entitled to our own opinion, because there's no need for backbiting and all the stuff that goes on in life. And anyhow, get off of that. He said a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep, a time to mourn, a time to laugh, and a time to dance or to be happy. And he's talking about, the times in life that we go through, these seasons of life that we go through. Brother Ray McManus, he uses that term seasons of life quite a little bit in his normal conversations. And we have bad things that happen, that'll just bring us to tears. And we have family members that die, people that we love and die, and they get sick or whatever the purpose, however it happens. But there's a time to weep. I think about, we talked about in Job here a few weeks ago, how that when Job lost his all his family and all his way of making a living and everything, and he mourned and he wept and he sat in ashes and scraped his sores where the devil had afflicted him with all that, and there was a time for that. There was a time to mourn the passing of his family, and all that, and that, in scripturally speaking, when you look at that, it says that his three friends, they came and sat down with him, and they were silent for 7 days. There was a time for them they were mourning. They rent their clothes, and it says that they mourned with Job. But then there's a time to mourn, that there's a time to laugh and to be happy, and life kicks us around sometimes, but all at the same time, overall, when it's all said and done, I can't speak for you all, but for me, I have enjoyed life, seen a lot of tough things, but in the final analysis of it, I have enjoyed, and still do, for that matter. I do. I enjoy doing what I'm allowed to do or have the time to do, and so anyway, I think that's a good thing. It says a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. And in that stone thing, there's a couple of different ways of looking at that. And the one way we'll talk about here is that in that part of the world, they had to clear stones out of a field before they could plant it. There was a season for that. They had to get in there and get the field cleaned out. I think even here in southeast Missouri, we see those they call them rock rakes that you can buy down here at Orsolin's farm store. At any of the farm stores, you can pick them up, and they're for pulling rakes up out of your fields so you can plant and harvest. And there's a time for that. There's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from that time. There's a time for physical contact with other people and in the right way, whether it's your wife or your friends. We're big here at church on shaking hands and giving people the right hand of fellowship, and there's a time for that. And sometimes there's just a time not to do that. We've all dealt with this COVID thing for way over a year now, and we've done away from that. Sometimes during flu season, Brother Steve will just kind of wave at everybody and not shake hands or hug or anything like that. And so that's kind of the explanation of all that. He goes on there in verse 6. He says a time to get and a time to keep. Sometimes you make money, maybe even on a financial way, you might make money, you have more money coming in, and a time to keep it. But then there's a time to lose too. Everything is a give and take. It's an ebb and flow in this world. And I'm going through these individually, but yet at the same time, we have to recognize and not ever lose sight of the fact that God has a purpose. There is a purpose for that. And when these times come, then we need to not lose sight of the fact that He is in charge and He's sovereign, and He will guide and direct. It's like building a big building. I can be working on the third floor on one building, and somebody's working on the first floor in that same building, and I don't know what they're doing, but yet we're both doing our job, and when it's all said and done, the building's completed, and the owner can take possession of it. And it's keeping our focus on what our mission is, whatever God has laid upon us to do, and being faithful to do that. And that is, if God has called you to it, then be faithful to it and do it. And because there's a time for that, and make the best of that time. That time is the most valuable thing we have, and how we spend that time tells us where we are rating spiritually. But by the same token, we don't want to get into a situation where we just do things and stay scheduled up all the time, where we don't have time at all to enjoy this life that God has put us in. So anyway, to move on with that, in verse 7, he says a time to rend, or a time to tear, again, and a time to sow. There's a time there, sometimes that to rend or to tear. Sometimes God just moves us when we're not really ready to be moved, like from one church to another. Just because a person goes from Temple Baptist Church, say, to First Baptist Church, that doesn't mean that there's something bad wrong, that maybe God's just dealt with them this time to make a change, or vice versa. And it has come. It has worked both ways. It does that here, but there's a time there to pull apart, to pull away, maybe, and be moved from one place to another, or from one ministry to another within the church. And God will use you to do that if you are humble and will follow His direction in your life. He goes on there, a time to keep silent and a time to speak. And I mentioned there a while ago about Eliphaz and Zophar and the three friends, and they were they came, and it says for 7 days they were silent. They did not speak, and they mourned with Job in that time. But then there's a time to speak. Later on in that same book, we see that Elihu, the young man, he came and he said that he was about to blow his stack. He said, I'm about to blow up with this word, and I've got to share it. And so he began to really give Job up and down the road on that. But when it was all said and done, and God began to call them into account, Elihu was the only one that he did not require a public apology to Job to. And that was kind of interesting, because what Elihu had to say was right. What he had to say about God and what he had to say about Job was right in the context that he spoke in. And so there's sometimes there's a time to just keep your mouth shut, and that's the best way. Sometimes, though, it's time to speak up, and so that's where it's at. He says, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. That word there again, hate. Back over in Luke, we mentioned this last week, but back over in the book of Luke, if I could find that, this is where I'm not in the right spot for some reason. In chapter 14, and now back over in the book of Luke in the New Testament, chapter 14 and verse 26, it said, if any man come to me and hate not his father and mother, and this is red letter, this is Jesus talking, his wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Now that word there, hate, is not a word of loathing or anything, or being despicable or anything like that. It's a matter of priorities, that God has to be the number one thing in our life, and then our family. And that's what he's saying. But he's not saying there that we would hate one another. But this time to love and a time to hate, a time to reset priorities in our lives. Sometimes we all just need to refocus and get back to what God wants us to do. He says, and you know, I love my church and the people in it. I don't have I just don't have ill will towards anybody in this church, and we've been here for a long time now. But that love there, and there we are at in Temple Baptist Church. We are at a time in peace, and have been for a long time, as long as I've been here, in the 20 years, a little over 20, and we are a church that believes in that, and from, you know, I'm not saying that there's not issues come up, but we deal with those in the right way and not with hate and discontent. But Solomon went on then and he said, what profit hath he that worketh that, and wherein he laboreth? I have seen the travail. There's that word again, sore travail, that he used over there, the useless, meaningless labor that we do. You know, there's a statistic that says that if you have a couple or a person that comes and joins your church, if you don't find them something to do, something meaningful to do, not just something that is mindless but something meaningful for that person to do, that according to statistics, in a year they won't be there if there's not some way found to assimilate them into your local church. But God said, I have seen the travail, or Solomon said, I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He hath made everything beautiful in his time, and also he set the world in his heart so that no man can find out the work. There's too much in this world to go and do for everybody. Remembering back from last week where Solomon said he set his mind through wisdom to know all these things. And he's saying here, there's just too much. There's no way any one person can come up with all that. And you know, he talks about this, but he also talked about that man needs a job. He needs to work. Work was given to man to do in the Garden of Eden. Adam that was his job. Him and Eve's job was to tend the garden, and it was not. It was ministry and it was work, but it wasn't toil and labor and sweat. You know, some people just they don't want to be even around work, but nobody ever drowned because of sweat. I've seen that on a bumper sticker somewhere, but that's nobody ever drowned from sweat. And work is good for us. It keeps us busy, keeps us focused. It gives us a focus in life that we can look back and see that we have done some good, and that's important to man. He goes on then and he says, I know that there's no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and do good in his life. We ought to have good works. We ought to do things that help other people as much as we can. That's a ministry in itself. He repeated verse 24 of chapter 2 again here in verse 13. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is a gift of God. And you know, that's that thing that God wants you and me to be happy in our life. He doesn't desire that we just go through life miserable. We were not created for that. Brother Steve uses that word abundant life quite a bit in his sermons, and we're just we just need to realize that we are a child of God, and we're here at His because of Him, because He has things for us to do, and so we ought to live like it and act like it in our life. And he goes on there in these last two verses, I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing shall be put to it or anything taken away from it. And God wants us He gives us a job to do and He expects us to do it. And if we don't do it, somebody will. When the time he may work some things around, but you can't take away from what God does. And the thing about that is that when we do it God's way, it will be right. It will not be something that has to be come back and redone over and over and over again. And so anyway, that's pretty much the lesson here today. And so I'm going to quit. I'm going to invite you to come to church. We'll have the second service starting here in just a little while. Come and be a part of that. And if we can't, maybe we'll see you next week. So thanks a lot.